Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books.
Hello and welcome to Tsundoku. I'm Kath Keneally.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. And of course, we've had the holidays,
Here
which
we are.
is reading addicts' time of heaven when you can just sit down with a pile of books and not feel guilty about it. Kath, what have you been up to?
That's right. Although somehow this holiday didn't involve it's a lot of sitting down, a lot of jumping up again to do to do other things. But I got a lot of books read, and in fact reread, having watched Slow Horses, the series on Apple TV. I went back and reread all the Mick Herron novels, and my head is still full of them.
Can you just give me a bit of a blurb about Mick Herron, because you've got me interested and I'm not sure why. What is it about these novels?
He's a very cluey and very literate author. He's Oxford-based. I don't know if he's an Oxford Don, but he reads like one. And he enjoys himself enormously with these kind of anti-spy stories where he's invented a place called Slough House, S-L-O-U-G-H House, and it's populated by so-called slow horses who are rejects from MI5 who've blotted their copybook in somewhere or another, and they're being led, if that's the right word, by this appalling character called Jackson Lamb, who puts on, really, as a persona. Who's he like? He's a little bit like DL in the DL and Pascoe novels. He's overweight. He has disgusting personal hygiene. He's no fun to be around, and he never gives a compliment. He's always he's smart mouth also. So he's an amusing character, but he's there for certain reasons, and he's obviously been a Joe, as they're called in his own time, behind the wall particularly. He always knows what's going on, and the slow horses always somehow manage to get there before the MI5 people proper do. And they in turn are led by outrageous first and second desks, both of them female, who are always plotting things mostly to do with their own survival.
Sounds marvellous. I can't wait to get my hands on them. I've been doing a bit of rereading too. I've reread John Mortimer, a book called A Summer's Lease, which was a BBC series in the 80s, but it's delightful and complex, and it's about Italy. It's about a family that go to Italy, and all sorts of strange things are happening behind the scenes, particularly to do with the water. So yeah, no, I'm really enjoying that. I rarely reread, but one of the things that surprises me when I do is I completely don't know what happens.
I know. And it's a bit alarming how little time has to pass before that is true.
Exactly. Now we've had a bit of an influx of WA books into the Tsundoku office lately, and Fremantle Press is doing a great job there. You have been talking to an author called Karen Herbert.
I have, and she just dropped into my hands. In fact, I picked up a book of hers second-hand, but it must have been given away quite soon after it appeared, called The Rivermouth. So I read that first. Kind of a crime novel, but more of a sociological investigation into small town life in WA, or coastal town. Very, very well done, very accomplished. You would imagine she'd been writing for a lot longer than she has, but in fact she started writing only a couple of years ago after she lost her job in aged care, which leads us to The Castaways of Harewood Hall, which was her first accepted manuscript, and that's the second book I read. It's remarkably like the Richard Osman series, a well-to-do retirement village full of somewhat entitled residents, but all with interesting pasts, and murky depths underneath the calm surface. Actually, she predated Osman, or at least they were probably writing their series at the same time without knowing.
Do you think as baby boomers age, we're going to see a lot more novels set in aged care?
I think we're going to have a flood of them. I feel, that there might be more than we can be bothered reading sometime very soon.
The older protagonist is about to hit the literary scene.
That's right. So Karen, I spoke to today and was delighted to meet her, and it turns out that part of her background does match the manager of Harewood Hall itself.
And here she is in that interview with you, Kath, talking about how she made that inspiring change to become a writer.
I was made redundant from a job in aged care in 2019, and I was totally gutted. I just loved that job, and I went home and I had a sulk, and the next morning I saw my husband off to work, and I sat down in my office, because that's what I do. I work. I was made to work, and I started writing, and I wrote Castaways. I wrote from 9 to 5 days a week, because I'm a boring person. And in 3 months, I had the book written. I didn't have another job yet, so I started The Rivermouth and I wrote that. And then I thought, well, what do I do with these things? And what people do with manuscripts is they send them to publishers, don't they? So I sent them both in, and the lovely people at Fremantle Press accepted them.
Well, I can imagine if I had been the person receiving the manuscripts, I would have skipped around the office a little bit, because they're both really polished pieces. And it did strike me, although Castaways of Harewood Hall was the second one to reach me, that was the first manuscript you completed and had accepted.
It was. I wrote that one from my heart. I loved working in aged care. I loved our residents. They were all just such delightful people with such wonderful stories and backgrounds and so much to share.
Harewood Hall, let's go there.
The idea for the Castaways of Harewood Hall actually didn't originate in aged care. It originated somewhere else. And earlier on in my career, I worked in universities and came to learn about research mice. And research mice are bred under very special conditions, and they're actually quite valuable. And I'd been wondering, as I looked at the research breeding facility at this university where I was working at, what would happen if any escaped their secure laboratories, and what sort of dilemmas they might create. So when I did come to writing a book, I thought, I could have escaped mice in an aged care facility and see what might happen.
And enter our absolutely sweet but slightly clueless Josh, who, doing a good deed for humanity as he thinks, rescues some of these threatened mice and hides them at the facility, and everything else follows. The whole book might have been very cute and sweet and nothing more, especially since you have a dog and a cat in primary roles. Harley the cat in particular is a wonderful creation, but somehow they are a way into the tensions and the darker things that are going on. In fact, on page 1, we're given simply a sentence from Harley. Harley accepted the obvious. He lifted his head from Elizabeth's arm, left the bed and climbed out of the window. It was time to move on. And gradually we realise that he's moving on because Elizabeth has died.
That's right. And, Elizabeth, she has died in her bed, and she's died the sort of quiet, peaceful death I suppose all of us hope for, don't we? For the majority of people, the last years of our lives are very rich and enjoyable times. And I wanted to show that in this book.
On the other hand, you also show how people moving from their own homes into this enforced community, however genteel it might be, are going to find some things difficult about being cheek by jowl with people they don't know and have to come to terms with and learn to rub along with. You must have had a decision to come to somewhere in the making of the book as to how sweet you would keep it and how nasty the sinister elements might be. And in fact, there's some fairly heavy-duty corruption going on with the Harewood Hall as its focus.
Well, yes, there is, isn't there? And I've worked in executive and on boards in aged care and disability, and organisations in these industries, they run on margins that are barely above water. And as I wrote the book, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do something to keep this organisation afloat that I absolutely can't do as a board member or an executive because it's illegal, but I could play with that in fiction.
Yeah.
So I did.
So you did. It's a delightful read with everything not quite tied up in a pretty pink bow at the end, in fact, which is just how we'd like it. A devilish dog, a curious cat, skullduggery in the basement. Well, you moved on from there to a much more sombre book altogether, The Rivermouth, where we're taken to a small coastal town and we're in the middle of a fairly nasty set of circumstances right from page one, where we meet Sandra, who's the mother of an adolescent boy who was murdered 10 years previously, and you give us that unpalatable fact right at the start.
It was a very different writing experience for me. I started writing The Rivermouth with a scene that eventually became chapter 4. And the scene was 3 teenage boys messing about on the banks of a river. And I drew on my memories of the Chapman River in Geraldton. And that was a place where we went as kids to act out the things you need to act out when you don't want to be observed by adults. You know, we'd test out our relationships and we'd throw sticks into the river and push each other in the water and leap off rocks and, you know, things that kids do. And I had the boys doing that, but just as their interactions started to play out, it occurred to me that things hadn't gone all that well for these kids, and there was something dark going to unfold in their lives, and I had the feeling that it was deeply embedded in the community, but I didn't quite know what. And that's not what I expected to experience as a brand new writer. I expected to write stuff and just know exactly where it was all going, but I didn't with this book. So I wrote the rest of the book to find out what was going to happen.
Well, it's my favourite kind of crime novel in the sense that it's really a sociological study of a small community and very tautly plotted on your behalf, and you reveal things to us by a technique of swinging us back and forth between a very short period of time between the day when Darren dies, 10 years in the past, in fact, day by day, and what's happening in the present, which is when the investigation has been reopened and Sandra's eyes are being opened to things that she hadn't suspected about her fellow town members.
It was a discovery process for me, and I found writing that book, it was actually quite a delight. I would write a scene and I'd write it in detail. Like I'd put a dog on a beach, and I'd get to much later in the book and I'd be writing something else. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's why that dog was there.
Oh, really?
And that discovery of how our brains work perhaps as we're writing stuff and what we're thinking about that we maybe don't really know that we're thinking about. As I've met other writers and I've talked to other people about how they write as well, and these are people who've been writing for much, much longer than I have, I hear the same thing, that sense of delight as they progress through a piece of work and they realise what they might have done and how that's all going to come together at the end.
Chapter 1, Sandra. This is what Sandra knows. She's 49 years old and she can see the river mouth from her kitchen. When the sandbar is open, the river stains the sea brown for as far as she can see. 10 years ago, her son was killed below the limestone cliffs at the riverbank. Last week, her best friend's body was found off a remote road in the Pilbara. Her friend's DNA matches the DNA scraped from under her son's fingernails. Now, I imagine if what you're saying is true, that chapter 1 must have come a fair way through the writing, because there are so many strands there. Barbara's story, not the least interesting.
I wrote that after I'd completed a lot of the boys' chapters.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote that that little short chapter at the start, mostly to bring my ideas together about where I thought it was going.
What were the elements that you wanted to mix into that small town cauldron?
What I wanted was to describe the sea that I swam in when I was a kid, living in a small town on the coast in Western Australia. I wanted to describe how everybody knows everybody, and how you can't escape from different types of people when you're in a small town. Where I live, and I'm sitting in a park right now where I've got better reception, I can see green lawn and roses and well-maintained houses. I won't see an Indigenous face all day. I will see people who have jobs, children who go to school every day, and households who don't have problems putting a meal on the table at night. You don't get that in a small town. You get that in a city. And in a small town, you stand in line at the pharmacy with people who are homeless and with people who are unemployed and people who come from all walks of life and all different sorts of professions. And I wanted to show that and what that means for the way people make sense of their world. I also wanted to show how people know stuff, but they don't know stuff. They know stuff implicitly. Like there's stuff Sandra knows implicitly, but she doesn't confront it. She doesn't sit there and go, I know this thing. And so those things, because they are only implicitly known, they don't get discussed. And secrets are held without really thinking about holding secrets. And I wanted to show that as well.
Yes, and it's brilliantly done. Of course, there are some people who are quite deliberately holding on to secrets, and they're the ones who are most crucially concerned in the bad things. We only find out the ins and outs of that right at the end.
That's right.
Yeah, it was terrifically well done. And
thank you.
You don't simply line up those sorts of characters that you're talking about, but you show us what their interconnections might be too. So, for instance, Arthur, the homeless man who is on the receiving end of quite a bit of ill treatment, has a more pleasant connection with one of the boys.
Yes, he does.
And then there's the Indigenous mob who live outside the town and who have various connections. That's, you touch on lots of touchy subjects, ordinary yet chilling casual racism in a town like that, the violence that's always simmering away in one place or another, kids being mistreated or just led astray, and the pack mentality, I think, comes across very well in the sorts of snap judgments that people make and then everybody somehow believes and goes along with.
Yes, that's what it was like in my town when I grew up. But it wasn't all bad either. There were those things, and there was that background tension and that background violence, but there was also a level of care. And I think you see that in Sandra and in Barbara in this book. They want to be good people. They're living their lives being mothers and working in their professions, and they want to be good people in their communities. So they watch out for people and they look after people, almost without thinking about it.
That's right. And Sandra herself is in a caring profession.
That's exactly right. She's a nurse in the emergency department in the local hospital, and she sees a lot of the side of her town that perhaps some people wouldn't see.
And then all of that is set most beautifully in, as you say, the natural setting. You devote quite a bit of time to filling that in at every point, and it really makes the reading experience much deeper.
I really enjoyed describing that landscape from my childhood. And one of the things that I'm really, really pleased that I did, and that I did quite late in the piece, was I changed the name of the town to a fictitious town. And I discovered after talking to readers after the book was published that in doing that, it gave people the opportunity to guess where the town might be, or to use their own imagination and to imagine the town and the river as their river and their town. And I've spoken to so many people who've said to me, I know exactly where this is. This is on the mid coast of New South Wales, in this town and this riverbank where we went on our honeymoon. I love that so much. It just brings home all that stuff that we know as readers, because I obviously was a reader long before I was a writer. That everybody reads a book differently and imagines a setting differently and a character differently, and that's been an utter joy to have those conversations with people.
I bet. And you do, as I said, you do the interactions between the adolescent boys fantastically well, because a lot depends on that seeming to be plausible. It certainly seems very plausible to me. The things they get up to, their camaraderie, but it only goes to a certain depth, and they're not terribly dependable as friends, but that's because they're 14, 15, and that kind of thing.
That's right.
And you're always a little bit nervous they're going to go beyond safe limits, and indeed they do. And there's also a lot to admire about how you do the women and girls, how you draw the women who've been shaped by the sorts of possibilities that they imagine there are for them by growing up in a town like that. They've been limited by those, and the girls coming on also up to a point, and also in danger from various constant threats, but maybe about to forge different paths.
It was interesting writing those two different generations. Sandra, the number of times people have come up to me and said, how did you know? Sandra is me, or Sandra is my wife, or Sandra is my sister. It's exactly her. You've captured her perfectly. And for me, I wanted to write Sandra as my generation of women who, we've got to our late 40s. We've listened to what we were told when we were kids, that we could be and do everything. We could have careers, we could be mothers, we could run households, we could do charity work. There was nothing limiting us. But then, of course, we got to that age and went, why am I so bloody tired? What the hell just happened there? And we still want to do all those things, and we still want to be good people, but it's no longer coming from that energetic, bright-eyed, bubbly 20-year-old. It's coming from a sense of fatigue and of putting on our big girl boots every day and going out there. And that's what I wanted in Sandra. And it's so nice that other people get that when they read the book.
Yeah, it is. And the other character, who's much more of a loose cannon and equally interesting, is Barbara, of course, the best friend. What can you tell us, without too much spoiling, about her background and the kind of demons that are driving her?
Barbara didn't grow up in the town. She grew up somewhere else. She came to the town when she was married, and she had her first child at the same time that Sandra had her first child. And they became very good friends. But Barbara's background is unknown to her, and she eventually explores it and discovers it. And that raises lots of questions for her. And I suppose it happens off page, but I think there are a lot of conversations that Barbara and Sandra had over that period in their kitchens with a glass of wine or a cup of tea about what all this stuff meant.
I wonder, finally, what was the hardest thing to write about in all of those difficult subjects that you picked up and played with?
Oh, absolutely. The hardest part was talking about Indigenous matters. I was very aware that I grew up in a town where I went to school with a lot of First Nations children. The Yamaji population in my town was very disadvantaged. You know, it was in our face all the time. You couldn't look away from it.
Mm.
And what I wanted was to be true to the way people reacted to their environment. So I've got characters who talk about the Indigenous Yamaji characters in the book, and they do it in a way that I heard people talking about those sorts of matters when I was a kid.
Mm.
So people would fumble their way through and they would explore and sometimes get it right, sometimes get it wrong. They'd second guess. And I wanted to show that. I wanted to show people working their way through that. I didn't want to be black and white about it. I didn't want to have someone who just said, well, this is what it should be, and then have somebody who was overtly racist. I wanted to have people who occupied the middle and to make it safe for people to explore that middle and come to a solution. And look, I don't see that in writing at the moment. I don't see the safety in that for people, and I think people need to explore that in a safe way, because we don't all, arrive fully formed in the world with the right answers to everything. And I agonised over one scene in particular where two characters do that. I'm not sure if I got it right. I'm not sure if I got it wrong. I just wrote what I hear people saying. And that was hard. I found that hard. And I still wonder whether my judgment on that was correct.
I'm not surprised you say that. I think most people would, well, with any sensitivity, would find that very difficult. But I think you had a jolly good stab at it. It was very good. And let me say, I loved the ending, the very ending.
Oh, good.
Which actually features a little girl, well, a now teenager, who's come at the end of all of those difficult times and is connected to that Indigenous family. And she says something like her dad and granddad might be going to prison, but her surname is still enough to protect the little ones. So you've given her a package there, and you've given her something to be going on with, and you've given her an already formed purpose in life, and it just rang very true, and it was very satisfying.
Thank you. Well, you'll be pleased to know that a woman from that family appears in my third book.
Oh, good. And may I ask how far along that is?
That will be published in October, and it's called Vertigo, and there is a return to Weymouth in that book. Yes.
Karen, look at you go. Wow.
I'm having so much fun.
That's so fantastic. Well, I can't wait to read the third one. It's just been lovely to discover your writing, and long may you continue.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely chatting to you this morning.
Karen Herbert, I strongly recommend you look her up. She's a new voice to be reckoned with, certainly in crime fiction, and also if she follows up the Castaways of Harewood Hall with something similar, also very entertaining. The Rivermouth and the Castaways of Harewood Hall, Karen Herbert, Fremantle Press.
And now to our classic section, and we're having a look at romance. It's a genre that never goes away. It's enormously popular, but often it's a little bit sneered at by the literary world. Michaela's been looking into the world of bodice rippers and why they remain a guilty pleasure to so many women and men.
A little earlier this week, I sat down with an academic from Uni SA, Dr. Diane Velasquez. Throughout her career, she's been researching the topic of romance. And because librarians are often the gatekeepers to what we all read, she's been researching what they think of the genre. Romance is obviously a very broad church, so I began by asking Diane what she considers a romance.
The book that started it all was Pamela in the 1700s in Britain, and that book was actually written by a man, And then what happened next is you have Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and that kind of people writing in the romance, what we consider classic literature today, but it's actually romance. Looking at the 20th century, probably looking at the first 70 years, they pretty much didn't have a lot of sex in them. They had a little bit, but not a whole lot. It's after the 70s it changed dramatically, where you had... you could have what's called a sweet romance where it stops at the door, bedroom door. And then you could have one that's a little bit more where it goes a little further, but not too much. And then you have one where the door's slammed open and you see everything. So it's quite the range. And I've been reading for over 50 years in the romance genre.
Yep. You love romance?
I love romance. That's how this all started.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love romance. I read quite a range. And I also look for new authors all the time.
What romance titles got you started as a young person?
My mom had a collection of Barbara Cartland and Silhouette and Harlequin, which is the equivalent to Mills and Boons here.
Yeah.
And that's what I started reading when I was 10. So I've been reading for a long, long time. The early Harlequins and Silhouettes were very much the male was going to save the woman and rescue her from her dreary life. And that has changed dramatically as well. You have more independent women in the books. You don't have the savior complex with the man, or the hero complex is what I call it, because you don't need it anymore. Because life has changed dramatically and women have more options today than they ever have.
You started reading romance at 10 years of age, which was about the time I was reading Anne of Green Gables. And I have to say, I just found the chemistry between Gil and Anne was just electric as a young girl. I just found the romance of that, in addition to all the other fabulous themes of it, just wonderful. So, it seems universal almost, doesn't it?
It does. And one of the strongest aspects of a romance is all about the characters. The setting is number two, and for me it's the characters, how well the characters get on, how well they interact with one another. I like series for the, like 3 plus book series, because you get to revisit old favorites, people who maybe are having a baby or whatever, and you get to see what goes on. So it's always fun to see what happens in their life.
What did you then move on to?
I read Harlequin and Silhouette for a really long time, but then there was one author that came out of the Silhouettes, Nora Roberts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she did crime as well, didn't she?
She has done crime as well, and that's who I started reading at first, and I've read them all. I also read her crime series, which is done by her in her pen name, J.D. Robb, the In Death series. She writes 2 books a year. I wish she wrote more.
I don't think that sounds possible.
Well, she writes 2 books a year in the crime area. Then she usually writes a trilogy, and then 2 standalone hardbacks.
She's a machine.
She is a machine, and she doesn't have anybody writing with her.
That was my next question.
She's
really?
She's not like James Patterson at all. She totally does all her own writing. So
wonderful.
It's definitely her stories. And within her stories, they've changed over the years. She has a lot more romantic suspense than she did before. She also has gotten into what I call the new age stuff, where it's paranormal, vampires, werewolves, that kind of thing. That was very popular when I was doing my thesis in 2006, 2007.
Well, the Twilight series were big, and it is a broad genre, isn't it?
It's extremely broad. It could be anything. I read, for instance, Nalini Singh, who's out of New Zealand, and she does a guild hunter series where they're looking for vampires who break their contract, and then in this parallel world. And then the other one's Psy Changeling, where you have were animals and then people who use their minds to do things. So they're very, very different.
And there's a bit of romance and...
Oh yeah, there's romance in them in the whole 9 yards, but it's romance and paranormal. Yeah.
What's the feeling that you think people get from romance?
I think it's a couple of things. For me, it's a little bit of escapism. Mm-hmm. So I get to escape my everyday world and go into the author's created world, and how they build the world is important. And also, it lets you see the idealized life, because let's be realistic, how romance is run in a romance novel isn't how romance runs in real life. The whole, I'm going to grow up one day and become a princess. Although God knows I would not want to have to do that, looking at the British royal family. So it's just, it's the whole concept of being happily ever after.
Yeah. It's relaxing.
It's relaxing. You've got what they call the HEA, the happily ever after. And so it's all about that.
Do you think men read romance?
Yes. They do.
What do you know about that?
One of my colleagues used to be at a public library, and she had some males who were widows who who wanted the sweet romances, and they liked to read them because it reminded them of their wives, and it gave them.
That just kills me.
Yeah,
That's beautiful.
When she told me that, I almost cried.
Yeah.
So it was just like I never thought about it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But there's also other men who read, pretty much. Based on the Romance Writers of America statistics, about 18% of readers are men.
Wow. I thought you would have said 3%, 2%.
That's in the U.S., but still 18%.
Yeah.
So, and the median age in the U.S. is 30 to 39, and I would say that's probably comparable here. I'd also say you probably have a 40 to 49. I think it's 30 to more 49 would be your mid-range, where everybody
Age group.
Your big group. But you have a lot of seniors who read this because this is what we read when we were kids.
Yeah.
So everybody just loves it. It's a fun place to go.
If we circle back to your research, which is looking at librarians' perceptions of romance readers, it must be tough if they've got certain perceptions. If you're a male who's wanting to get a romance book, do men have a sense of embarrassment about borrowing romance?
I'm going to tell you a little story about when I got hired at the university I worked for in the U.S. I was sitting outside the room. It was at a conference, and I was sitting outside the room reading a romance novel. And the dean of the school was shocked that I was reading a romance novel in public. She felt it shouldn't be done, that people shouldn't be reading romance, and that reading romance was trash.
It reflected poorly on you.
Yes, but they hired me anyway. But
Good.
But I defended my choice, and I explained why. And I said, why should we hide what we read? All that matters is that we read. You know, it doesn't matter if you read a comic book, a graphic novel, or a novel. It doesn't matter. You're reading. I read them all the time.
Yep.
I have no problem with it. But I think some people come to the library and they're hesitant to show what they're reading because they feel there's judgment. Why aren't you reading something better? It's the whole high culture versus low culture argument, which I really detest.
Do you think that there's an element of misogyny in there, that going right back? Yeah, she's nodding. There's a very big nod there.
The biggest issue with romance novels is they're literature written for women by women. It's not part of the white Anglo-Saxon male dominant culture. So if it's written by women and it's the number one best-selling genre in the world, it's a $1 billion brand, something must be right about it. It's interesting, and I think misogyny has a big deal to do with it. That our culture, particularly in the 1900s, you know, right in the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of the library stuff was dictated by white males. And so they thought you need to read the classics. You should be reading Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff.
Who's very romantic. A lot of his stuff is, but see, then they take it out of the romance genre and put it in the literature genre. Like The Great Gatsby, if that had been written by a woman, how might it have been perceived?
Exactly. Well, if you look at books, classics from pre-1920, the majority of them are white males, and the majority of them are European or American. So you have to think about from that perspective. There's a few in there, like you'll have a Jane Austen, a Bronte, but they'll have one book. Pride and Prejudice is usually the one, or Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. Those are the three books that you'll hear about. You may hear about Little Women, but not so much.
I found this very interesting quote. I'll just see if I can read that. I'll make it a little larger. Like a lot larger.
I'd have to have my glasses on.
I read a piece of writing, and within a paragraph or two, I know whether it's by a woman or not. I think it is unequal to me. My publisher, who was so good as a taster and editor, when she became a writer, lo and behold, it was all this feminine tosh. I don't mean this in an unkind way. That's V.S. Naipaul. I don't know how to say his name. Naipaul. So he wrote India, A Million Mutinies Now, and In a Free State, which won the Booker Prize. I mean, that's pretty severe, isn't it? That is a real distaste for anything written by a woman. So you can imagine anyone who's a woman writing romance doesn't stand much of a chance against the sort of the kings of literature.
One of the things that's happened in the last 10 years, 15 years, is the e-publishing trend through Amazon and some of the other booksellers. And I know libraries hate that because they can't get access to the books because you individually own your copyright if you write in that way. But a lot of romance writers start there, and then their books take off, and then a publisher notices them. That's a really interesting way to be found. And like when you think about 50 Shades of Grey, that was fan fiction. And again, it was online. It wasn't submitted to a publisher. It was only later that it got published. So it's really interesting how the publishing world is changing.
Yeah.
Whether they want to or not.
Dr. Diane Velasquez, she's Program Director for Information Management at UniSA, and she was talking romance with our colleague Michaela Andreev. Apparently the full title of that very first romance novel that Diane referred to at the start of the interview is Pamela or Virtue Rewarded. Possibly no sex in that one. It was written by Samuel Richardson in 1740. And apparently it was so popular that he wrote a sequel in 1742. We might just have to look them up sometime on Sundoku.
I'm David and I'm over 60. When I was really young, I used to go into our butler's pantry, it was called, but it was a big old house and it was quite narrow with shelves all around filled with books. So I just pull out books and look at them. But I lay on the floor with the door shut and just read and escape from the mayhem of the house around me. I was heavily into fantasy, and fantasy at that time was Enid Blyton and The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and that series. You just go to another world, and it was very exciting. I read a lot. Some self-help books. I read a lot of fiction, and I like autobiographies. So I'll go to second-hand bookshops and buy autobiographies. Recently I bought one on Gorton. Novels, I'll just read whatever Robin's got in book club, I'll read that. I liked Ian McEwan's books. I have authors that I'll read all their books. And science fiction for me was a quite important thread throughout my reading. So Asimov's books I liked, Dune I really liked. And again, it's that thing of going to a entirely different world. The most influential book I read when I was young was The Lord of the Rings, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And that went on to produce Blade Runner, which was one of my favourite films. And I didn't realise at the time that it was created from that short story. I've read to my children, so I read Pride and Prejudice to my daughter, and that's probably my favourite book. But also I enjoy reading their books, so whenever they get excited about a book or a series of books, I read them. And of course I became obsessed with Harry Potter as well. At the moment I'm reading The Devil's Dictionary, which is a science fiction about the environmental crisis we're in, and it's amazing. Reading allows me to escape everyday life.
That's it for another Sundoku. Don't forget, if you want to share with us what's in your bedside pile of books, you can contact us on sundokukast@gmail.com, and you could send us an email and ask us to ring you, which we will do if you want us to record.
Yes, we can ring you and record your Sundoku, you talking about your reading past and your reading habits, or you can record it yourself, of course, on a phone and just send us an MP3. So think about it. We would love to hear what you like to read.
We would indeed. We could do with a few clues. Although, I must say, the pile here is reaching to the roof.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev,
Annie Hastwell,
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.